February 11, 1990. Outside Victor Verster prison, the South African summer sun beats down on the asphalt. Thousands have gathered at the gates. Millions more are glued to television screens, from London to New York to Tokyo. They are waiting for a ghost. For 27 years, his face has been hidden from the world. To the government, he is a dangerous terrorist. To his people, a messiah. But as the gates swing open, and an old man in a grey suit walks out, holding his wife's hand, the world realizes he is neither. He is a man. He raises his fist, not in anger, but in triumph. The crowd roars. But behind that famous smile lies a secret history. How did a barefoot country boy from the Transkei become the most wanted man in South Africa? How did an angry revolutionary, who once built bombs, transform into a global symbol of peace? And how did he survive 27 years in a concrete cell, without losing his mind, or his heart? This is not just the story of a politician. It is the story of a boxer, a lawyer, a fugitive, and a father. It is the story of a man willing to die for an ideal, who lived to see it come true. Walk with him now. From the green hills of his childhood, to the blinding quarry of Robben Island, and finally, to the steps of the presidency. This is the story of Rolihlahla Nelson Mandela. The prisoner who freed a country. Chapter 1, The Boy Who Defeated the Donkey. The sun burned hot over the green hills of Mvizo. The air smelled of dry grass, dust, and cattle. In the middle of a clearing, a small boy named Rolihlahla faced his opponent. It was not a British soldier. It was not a rival warrior. It was a donkey. Rolihlahla, barely 7 years old, grabbed the animal's mane and hauled himself onto its back. He wanted to look like a chief riding into battle, regal and commanding. But the donkey had other ideas. It bucked, hard. The world spun. Rolihlahla flew through the air and landed, thump, right into a waiting thorn bush. The thorns tore at his skin. The breath was knocked out of his chest. But the sharpest pain didn't come from the scratches. It came from the sound of laughter. Around him, the other herd boys were doubled over, pointing and jeering. He scrambled out, his face burning hotter than the sun. He had tried to be a king. The donkey had made him a fool. He lashed out, his small fists clenched, his pride stinging, ready to fight the boys who dared to mock him. Later that evening, as his cuts were being tended to, perhaps by his mother, her hands gentle on his scraped arms, a lesson was passed down. It was a quiet piece of wisdom that would outlast the scars. Rolihlahla, she said, her voice grave. Remember this day. To humiliate another person is to make them suffer unnecessarily. It is a cruel waste. He didn't know it then, rubbing his sore limbs, but this was the first brick in the foundation of his life. Even a boy destined for greatness had to learn that dignity is something you give to others, even when they laugh at you. Rolihlahla was born in 1918 in the tiny village of Mvizo, in the Transkei region of South Africa. It was a world of rolling green valleys and round, thatched roof huts called rondavels. Here, time wasn't measured by clocks, but by the sun and the seasons. His name, Rolihlahla, meant, pulling the branch of a tree. Colloquially, it meant, troublemaker. It was a fitting name for a boy full of energy and questions. His early years were spent in the fields. As a herd boy, he was free. He spent his days stick fighting, Rithintitha, with the other boys. This was not just a game. It was his first school. Holding the long wooden sticks, he learned to watch his opponent's eyes, to predict the strike before it came, and to parry the blow. He learned that brute force was useless without strategy. But the real education happened at night. When the sun dipped below the hills and the cooking fires were lit, the elders would speak. Young Rolihlahla would sit in the shadows, listening. The old men, with their grey beards and deep voices, did not tell fairy tales. They told of the wars of resistance. They spoke of King Hintsa and Sekikun, great African leaders who had fought to keep their land from the white invaders. They spoke of a time before the British, before the Boers, when the African people were free to roam the land of their birth. Listening to the crackle of the fire and the rhythm of their voices, the boy felt a strange stirring in his chest. These were not just stories of the past. They were a secret history of sovereignty and loss. Then, the upheaval came. His father, Gadla Henry, was a proud man, a counselor to the king. But pride was a dangerous thing for a black man in a white man's colony. One day, Gadla defied a white magistrate over a trivial administrative matter. He refused to appear when summoned. The punishment was swift and absolute. The government stripped him of his title, his land, and his wealth. Overnight, the family fell into poverty. They were forced to leave Mvizo for the village of Kunu. When his father died soon after, it seemed like the end of Ralilala's world. But tragedy opened a door. Because of his father's noble standing, the young boy was adopted by the regent, Janjantaba, the paramount chief of the Thembu people. He packed his few belongings in a tin trunk and was taken to the great place at Nkekazwini. It was a different universe. He swapped his blanket for trousers. He went to a mission school, where a teacher, following the common custom, had already given him the English name, Nelson, back in Kunu. But the most important classroom was the regent's court. Every day, local chiefs and commoners came to the great place to settle disputes. Young Nelson watched from the periphery. He noticed something peculiar about the regent. Janjantaba did not shout. He did not dictate. He listened. He listened to the rich man, and he listened to the poor man. He let every person speak until they had nothing left to say. Only at the very end, when the sun was setting, would the regent speak, weaving everyone's views into a consensus. It was a revelation. Leadership was not about shouting orders. It was about listening. It was about moving the herd together, without using the whip. By the time he was 16, two powerful forces had been forged in him. From his royal blood and his life in the regent's palace, he inherited an unshakable, aristocratic confidence. He walked tall. He believed, deep down, that he was equal to any man on earth. But from the lesson of the donkey, and the silence of the regent's court, he learned empathy. He learned that true power connects with people rather than crushing them. These two traits, the pride of a prince and the patience of a listener, might have seemed contradictory. But they were the steel and the fire that would forge a leader capable of changing the world. The final step into manhood arrived with the traditional Xhosa initiation. Along with the other boys of his age, Nelson was taken to a secluded lodge in the mountains. They were circumcised, a painful, visceral ritual marking the death of the boy and the birth of the man. Faces painted with white clay, wrapped in blankets, they were taught the secrets of their tribe. At the end of the ceremony, he was given his new name, Dalibunga, founder of the Bunga, or maker of parliaments. He walked down from the mountain with his head high. According to the laws of his ancestors, he was now a man. He was a leader. He was free. But the world had a cruel surprise waiting for him. Shortly after his return, the reality of South Africa slapped him in the face. It might have been a white shopkeeper calling him boy instead of sir, refusing to serve him until the white customers were done. It might have been the sight of a dignified elder humiliated by a young policeman demanding a passbook. The realization was a cold, sickening weight in his gut. The law of his ancestors declared him a man, a leader, Dalibunga. The law of his country saw only a boy, a native, a unit of labor. The two truths could not both stand. The collision between his royal upbringing and the racist laws of his country sparked a fire that would never go out. He could not be a man in a cage. And so, with the pride of Dalibunga burning in his chest and the insult of the world stinging his cheeks, Nelson Mandela decided to run. Chapter 2, City of Gold, City of Shadows. The year was 1941. When Nelson Mandela stepped off the train at Park Station, he did not just arrive in a city, he walked into an assault. Johannesburg. The City of Gold. EchoLib. To a young man raised in the quiet, rolling hills of the Transkei, where time was measured by the sun and the slow grazing of cattle, this place was a different planet. The air itself tasted different. Acrid, metallic, thick with the sulfur fumes of the mines and the smoke of coal fires. Everywhere he looked, there was movement. He saw the mine dumps, enormous, man-made hills of pale yellow sand, the waste vomited up from the earth's belly in the search for gold. He saw the northern suburbs shimmering in the distance, a fortress of white wealth with green lawns and swimming pools. And he saw the shadow of that wealth. The teeming, dusty streets of the townships, where tin shacks leaned against each other and the red dust coated the back of your throat. The noise was deafening. The constant crunch-grind-crush of the stamp mills crushing rock deep underground vibrated through the soles of his feet. Yet, cutting through the industrial roar, he heard the defiant wail of a saxophone drifting from a hidden shebeen, and the laughter of gangsters in sharp American suits. He stood there, gripping his suitcase, a country boy in a suit that suddenly felt too tight. He realized with a dawning awe and horror that this beast of concrete and greed was built on, and fed by men like him. Johannesburg had just swallowed the young man from the hills whole. His first taste of this new world was bitter. To survive, the chief's son took a job as a night watchman at a mine compound. Standing alone in the dark, clutching a wooden club, he saw the machinery of oppression up close. He saw the migrant workers, men who had traveled hundreds of miles to feed their families, herded into concrete barracks like cattle. They slept on concrete bunks, stripped of their dignity, their names replaced by numbers. He heard their coughing in the night, the sound of lungs turning to stone from the silica dust. But the humiliation didn't stay behind the mine gates. It followed him into the city's glowing center. Eventually, Mandela found work as a clerk at the law firm of Witkin, Seidelsky and Eidelman. It was a prestigious place, a liberal firm where a black man could wear a suit and sit at a desk. The sympathetic Jewish solicitor, Lazar Seidelsky, offered him a crucial foothold. But even here, the venom of racism seeped through the cracks. One afternoon, a white secretary came to his desk. She held a file in her hand, her fingers pinching the corner as if it were dirty. Mandela reached out to take it. She pulled back, her eyes wide with disgust. She wouldn't touch his hand. She dropped the file on his desk with a sharp thwack and turned away, wiping her fingers on her skirt. He sat frozen. The heat rose in his cheeks, a burning mix of shame and rage. He was a royal son. He was a university student. But in this city, to her, he was just a boy. He clamped his jaw shut, forcing his face to remain a mask of calm. He learned a hard lesson that day: in the city of gold, his mind, his lineage, and his heart did not matter. His blackness defined him first. Yet, this law firm was also a window. As he filed papers and read briefs, he began to see the skeleton of the beast. He saw how the pass laws and the land acts weren't just abstract forces of nature. They were written down. They were case number 2847, section 12, b. Tools deliberately crafted in Parliament and wielded in courtrooms to break lives and keep men on their knees. And he realized, to fight this enemy, he had to master its language. It was in this crucible of ambition and anger that he met the man who would sharpen his soul, Walter Sisulu. They met at the Bantam Men's Social Center, the beating heart of black intellectual life in the city. Sisulu was not a tall man, but he radiated a power that filled the room. He was a former gold miner who had been fired for organizing a strike, a man who had taught himself everything he knew. Sisulu looked at the tall, eager Mandela. He saw the royal confidence, the quick temper, the burning desire to lead. But he also saw the rawness. "You have a fighter's spirit, Ralilala," Sisulu told him one evening, his voice low and steady amidst the noise of the center. "But to win a war, you need a general's mind. Anger is fuel, but strategy is the engine. Let me show you how to think like a general." Sisulu became his anchor. He even helped pay for Mandela's studies, investing in the young man's potential. Mandela threw himself into his education with a ferocious hunger. He enrolled at UNISA to finish his law degree. Picture him at night in a cramped room in the township of Alexandra. The single candle flickers, casting long shadows on the peeling walls. He is exhausted. His eyes burn. But he forces himself to read the dry, dense paragraphs of Roman Dutch law. He wasn't just studying for a grade. He was forging a weapon. Every statute he memorized, every legal precedent he understood, was a blade he was sharpening to slide between the ribs of the apartheid state. Education, he told himself, rubbing his tired eyes, is the most powerful weapon which you can use to change the world. This weapon soon found its mark. Along with his brilliant friend Oliver Tambo, he would later open the first black-run law partnership in Johannesburg, Mandela and Tambo. It would become a sanctuary, a place where the oppressed could find a voice within the very system designed to silence them. But the sky was darkening. The year turned to 1948. The general election approached, and the air in the townships grew heavy with dread. The National Party, led by the dour D.F. Malin, was campaigning on a terrifying new platform. They had a word for it, a word that sounded like a bone snapping: apartheid. Apartness. It was not just the racism of the past. It was a vision of total, legalized separation. A grid of steel to be placed over the entire nation. On election night, Mandela huddled in a small room in Soweto with Sisulu and Tambo. The rain drummed against the tin roof. The only light came from the orange glow of the radio dial. They sat in silence, listening to the returns come in, district by district. Static. A voice announcing numbers. Static. They hoped against hope that the more moderate party would hold on. But as the night wore on, the tide turned. The rural white vote surged. The National Party was winning. When the final result was announced, the room didn't explode in anger. It imploded into a cold, heavy silence. The National Party had won. Sisulu closed his eyes, his face a mask of weary resignation. Tambo let out a long, slow breath, staring at the floor. They knew what this meant. The door to gradual change, to polite negotiation, had just been slammed shut and bolted from the outside. Mandela looked at his friends. Then he looked at the stack of law books on the table, the books he had spent years mastering, the weapons he believed could bring justice through the system. As the radio hissed its final verdict into the dark room, Nelson Mandela understood. The law he had sworn to practice had just been officially weaponized against his people. The time for appealing to the conscience of the state was over. Slowly, deliberately, he closed the heavy cover of the law book before him. A new chapter, written in a different language, would have to begin. Chapter 3, The Black Pimpernel. The air in the safe house was stale, smelling of cold tea and nervous sweat. Mandela stood by the window, adjusting the peaked cap of a chauffeur's uniform. Outside, the world was a grid of shadows and spotlights. Ring. The telephone shrieked once. The signal. They're here, a voice whispered from the kitchen. Mandela didn't panic, he moved with the practiced calm of a man who had already died a dozen times in his mind. He slipped out the back door just as the heavy thud-thud-thud of boots hit the front porch. He didn't run, running invited bullets. Instead, he walked. He kept his head down, shoulders slumped, mimicking the weary gait of a servant heading home after a long shift. Behind him, the night exploded with the glare of searchlights and the bark of orders. He melted into the crowd at the bus stop, just another invisible face in a city that refused to see him. The next morning, the newspapers were breathless. They called him the Black Pimpernel, after the legendary hero who snatched aristocrats from the French guillotine. He was a phantom, a headline, a folk hero who was everywhere and nowhere at once. But the truth was grimmer. Nelson Mandela was no longer a lawyer or an activist. He was a ghost, a secret moving through his own country, waiting for the wind to change. The wind changed on March 21, 1960. Sharpeville. The images charred themselves into Mandela's soul, 69 bodies strewn across the pavement like discarded clothes, shot in the back while fleeing. Peaceful protesters met with the iron lead of the state. For Mandela, the sound of those bullets was the sound of a door slamming shut forever. We have stood for 50 years with our arms folded, he told a secret gathering of the ANC leadership. The room was dim, the faces tight with grief and fury. And for 50 years, the government has answered us with massacre. The time has come for the child of Africa to stop pleading for his rights. If the state answers our peaceful cries with bullets, we must learn to speak the only language it understands. It was a grave birth. They called the new movement Umkhonto we Sizwe, MK, the spear of the nation. Mandela, the man of law, was now a man of war. On December 16, 1961, the Afrikaner Day of the Covenant. The first explosions rocked South Africa. They weren't meant to kill, they were meant to warn. Mandela watched from a distance as a power pylon buckled, the electrical arc lighting up the sky like a jagged neon blue scar. He didn't feel joy. He felt a heavy, cold resolve. He had crossed a river, and the bridge behind him was burning. In early 1962, the ghost left the country. Under a false passport, Mandela crossed borders like a shadow, emerging into a world he had only read about. In Ethiopia and Algeria, the sun felt different, it was the sun of free nations. He traded his suit for fatigues. He learned the weight of a rifle and the cold logic of a guerrilla fighter. He learned how to dismantle a gun in the dark and how to plan an ambush. A fellow African freedom fighter gripped his shoulder one evening by a campfire. "Your struggle is our struggle," the man said. "Your prison is our shame." But the global hero was a ghost at home. While he was being hailed as a leader abroad, his personal life was fracturing into dust. The strain of the underground life was a weight on his heart. He missed his children's birthdays, he ached for the sounds of a normal home. He was sacrificing the man he was for the symbol the nation needed. August 5, 1962. A quiet country road near Howick. Mandela was back in South Africa, driving from Durban toward Johannesburg. He was disguised once more as a chauffeur named Cecil Williams. The car hummed, the road stretching out like a ribbon of uncertainty. He felt the net tightening. He had seen the same dark sedan in his rearview mirror twice in the last hour. Then, the blue lights flickered. A police car signaled him to pull over. Mandela's hand drifted toward the glove compartment. Inside lay a loaded pistol. For a split second, time slowed to a crawl. He could fight. He could turn this quiet road into a battlefield. But he looked at the officers approaching and saw the futility of the gesture. A shootout meant certain death, and the mission was bigger than his life. He took a breath and let his hand fall away from the weapon. The policeman leaned down, his face appearing at the driver's side window. He didn't look for a license. He smiled, a thin, victorious smile of a man who had finally caught his prize. Well, Nelson Mandela, the officer said, his voice dripping with cold satisfaction. You've had a long journey. Mandela looked straight ahead at the darkening road. The game of the Black Pimpernel was over. The long night of the prisoner was about to begin. Chapter 4, The 17-Month Manhunt. The silence was the first thing that tried to break him. After months of high-speed chases, secret meetings, and the adrenaline-fueled life of a fugitive, the stillness of the police cell felt like a physical weight. Nelson Mandela sat on a cold stone bench, still wearing the peaked cap and dust-coated coat of Cecil Williams' chauffeur. The disguise that had served him so well was now a mocking costume, a remnant of a mission that had ended on a quiet country road. Initially, the air in the cell held a flicker of grim hope. The state had charged him with inciting workers' strikes and leaving the country without a passport. 5 years, his lawyers whispered. Maybe less. 5 years was a long time, but it was a finite sentence. He could survive 5 years. He could study. He could plan. The world believed the Black Pimpernel had been tamed, but not destroyed. Then, the door to his cell grated open. A detective walked in, not with a baton or a list of questions, but with a casual, terrifying smile. "Oh, by the way, Mandela," the detective said, leaning against the damp wall. "We had a bit of luck. We raided a farmhouse in Rivonia. A place called Lily's Leaf. We found quite a library. Diaries, maps, battle plans, enough paper to wrap around the whole ANC." The blood drained from Mandela's face. The title of the state's hunt had just changed. They hadn't been hunting for a man, they had been hunting for the evidence to hang him. The 17-month manhunt for the Black Pimpernel was over, but the state's hunt for his life had just begun. Mandela was transferred to Pretoria local prison, a place designed to hollow out a man's spirit. Here, the world shrank to the size of a concrete box. Solitary confinement was a war of the mind. He lived in an unending cycle of grey walls, grey porridge, and the grey silence of guards who were forbidden to speak to him. He could hear the distant echoes of other prisoners, the muffled coughs, the clatter of tin plates, but he was a ghost among ghosts. Then, the storm finally broke. In October 1963, Mandela was brought to the Palace of Justice in Pretoria. He wasn't alone. As he was led into the dock, he saw them, the high command of the revolution. Walter Sisulu, Govan Mbeki, Ahmed Kathrada, and the others. They exchanged silent, fierce nods. In that moment, the claustrophobia of the cell vanished, replaced by the electric surge of solidarity. But the mood shattered when the prosecutor rose. The charges were no longer about strikes or passports. They were about sabotage, conspiracy, and the violent overthrow of the state. The word death hung in the air long before it was spoken. The penalty, the prosecutor announced, his voice clinical and cold, is death by hanging. A collective intake of breath hissed through the public gallery. The defendants' backs stiffened. The stakes had shifted from a prison term to the gallows. The trial for their lives had officially begun. April 20, 1964. The day the world stopped to listen. The defense was set to open its case. The international press was packed into the gallery, pens poised. The South African government expected Mandela to plead for mercy, to deny the violence, to beg for his life. Instead, Mandela rose. He was acting as his own attorney, but he wore no robes. He adjusted his glasses and looked past the judge, past the police, and straight into the eyes of history. His voice did not tremble. It was steady, resonant, and carried the weight of a million silenced lives. He did not call a single witness. He did not dispute the facts of the sabotage. Instead, he turned the dock into a pulpit. He spoke of the grinding poverty of the townships and the lack of human dignity that defined life for the black man. He justified the creation of MK, the spear of the nation, not as an act of bloodlust, but as a last, desperate resort when every channel of peace had been sealed with lead. I have fought against white domination, and I have fought against black domination, he declared, his voice rising in the hushed room. I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. Then, he stopped. He turned his gaze directly toward Judge DeWitt. The courtroom felt as though it were holding its breath, the very molecules of the air suspended in time. It is an ideal for which I hope to live and to achieve, Mandela said, his voice dropping to a low, powerful vibration. But if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a man who had just ascended from an accused criminal to a global apostle. Journalists forgot to write. His comrades wept silently. Even the guards looked away, unable to meet the eyes of a man who had just conquered the fear of death. The trial rushed toward its end, but the days that followed were the longest of Mandela's life. Back in the shadow of Pretoria Local, he had to grapple with his own mortality. He wrote letters of farewell. He put his meager affairs in order. He practiced a stoic calm for Sisulu and the others, but in the dark of his cell, he had to remind himself, courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. June 12, 1964. Judgment Day. The streets outside the Palace of Justice were lined with thousands of people. They didn't shout, they stood in a terrifying, silent vigil. Inside, the air was thick, suffocating. Mandela and his 8 comrades stood in the dock for the last time. Judge DeWitt entered. The rustle of his silk robes was the only sound in the stifling stillness. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and looked down at the 9 men whose lives rested in his hands. Mandela met his gaze, his hands steady on the wooden rail of the dock. The judge opened his mouth to speak. Chapter 5, Island of Ghosts. The trial was a spectacle. The prison was a silence. The boat ride across Table Bay was short, but it felt like a voyage to the edge of the world. As the ferry pitched in the grey, icy swells, the island emerged through the mist, Robben Island. It was low, flat, and barren, a desolate outcrop of rock and scrub. There were no trees here to provide shade, only the wind-whipped coastline and the bleak, white scar of a limestone quarry. When Nelson Mandela stepped onto the jetty, the world of lawyers and global headlines vanished. In its place was a machine designed to grind a man into dust. First came the processing. The guards, their faces tight with a practiced, impersonal hatred, worked with efficient brutality. Mandela's head was shaved, the dark hair falling to the cold floor like the leaves of a dead tree. Then came the uniform, coarse, ill-fitting khaki. He was given a pair of short trousers. It was a deliberate, stinging insult. In South African culture, only children wore short pants. He was no longer a leader. He was no longer a lawyer. He was a number, 466/64. A warden, a man with a voice like gravel, looked him in the eye. He didn't see a hero. He saw a nuisance to be erased. This is the island, the warden sneered. This is where you will die. Mandela was led to his cell in Section B. The iron door clanged shut, the sound echoing down the long, hollow corridor. He stood in the center of the room. It was 7 feet by 8 feet. If he lay down, his feet nearly touched the opposite wall. The world had shrunk to a concrete box and a single, barred window. The long night had begun. The sun on the island was not a source of life, it was a weapon. Every morning, the prisoners were marched to the limestone quarry. It was a hell of blinding white. The sun reflected off the pale stone with such intensity that it burned the retinas. There were no sunglasses. There was no reprieve. The dust, fine, white, and alkaline, filled their lungs and coated their skin. The lime from the stone burned their eyes and cracked the skin on their hands, a constant, low-grade agony. It permanently damaged Mandela's tear ducts. For the rest of his life, he would be unable to cry physical tears. The labor was a mockery of effort, breaking large rocks into small rocks. Then breaking those small rocks into dust. It was meaningless, back-breaking work intended to destroy the soul through repetition. Apartheid followed them even here. The hierarchy of oppression was absolute. Black prisoners received the smallest rations, a thin porridge and a cup of bitter coffee, while Indian and colored prisoners were granted an extra ounce of sugar or a piece of bread. It was a psychological war, an attempt to make them resent one another, to turn the oppressed against the oppressed. But the isolation was the cruelest cut. Mandela was allowed 2 letters a year. When they arrived, they were often a mockery of connection. The prison censors took their scissors to every page, cutting out names, dates, and expressions of love until the letters arrived as a lattice of holes, a ghost of the life he had left behind. In the winter of 1968, the silence of the cell became a tomb. A warden entered and handed Mandela a telegram. His mother, Nosekini Fanny, was dead. The woman who had tended his wounds after the donkey ride, the woman who had nurtured the boy Ralilala, was gone. Mandela requested permission to attend her funeral in the Transkei. The request was denied. He spent the night in the dark, standing at his window, staring toward the mainland he could not reach. 13 months later, in 1969, the hammer fell again. A scrap of news reached him through a sympathetic prisoner. His eldest son, Thembi, had been killed in a car accident. Mandela collapsed on his thin mat. The grief was a physical weight, a pressure in his chest that threatened to stop his heart. He was a chief's son who could not bury his mother. He was a father who could not bury his child. In that moment, the struggle felt like a void. He had sacrificed his freedom, his career, and now the very people he loved most. The walls of the cell were not just stone, they were the cold reality of his failures. What was left to fight for when everyone you loved was becoming a ghost? But the island did not break him. It hardened him. From the depths of his despair, a cold, crystalline resolve emerged. He stood up. He cleaned his cell. He realized that if the state had taken his family and his freedom, he would not let them take his mind. "The struggle is my life," he whispered to the stones. In the quarry, under the watchful eyes of the guards, a secret rebellion began. It started with a whisper. During a break, Mandela sat near a younger prisoner, his eyes shielded from the glare. "Listen," Mandela whispered. "Let us talk of the wars of 1806. Let us talk of why we are here." He began to teach. He taught history, philosophy, and politics. He even began to secretly study Afrikaans, the language of his oppressors. Why? Because to defeat his enemy, he had to speak their heart. He had to understand their fears better than they did. As the blinding white dust of the quarry filled the air, Nelson Mandela, prisoner, teacher, and student, began his most important lesson. He was laying the foundation. These whispered lessons in the dust would grow into a syllabus, a secret network of knowledge. The University of Stone was not yet built, but its first and most important professor had just begun his lectures. Chapter 6, The University of Stone. In the limestone quarry of Robben Island, the work was designed to break the body. But if you listened closely, past the crunch of stone and the shouts of guards, you heard something else, the sound of an empire being dismantled, one syllable at a time. The prisoners were clustered in small groups, their backs bent over the white rock. To a casual observer, they were merely laborers. But this was a facade. In one corner, Ahmed Kathrada was quietly reciting the history of the French Revolution. In another, Walter Sisulu led a hushed debate on the economic theories of redistribution. Lookouts were posted, eyes scanning for the glint of a warden's cap. When the guards drew near, the lecture vanished, replaced by the mindless swing of the hammer. When the guards passed, the University of Stone resumed its session. Robben Island was meant to be a tomb for their ideals, a place where the sun and the silence would bleach their minds as white as the limestone. Instead, the prisoners turned it into a greenhouse. In the blinding dust of the quarry, they were not just surviving, they were preparing to govern. The curriculum was as rigorous as any Ivy League institution. Those with degrees, lawyers like Mandela, teachers, and historians, became the professors. They drafted syllabi on the backs of cement bags and smuggled notes in the lining of their clothes. Mandela's most strategic decision, however, was his choice of study. He did not just study law or history. He began to study the enemy. He spent years mastering Afrikaans, the language of the people who had imprisoned him. He read their poetry, studied their theology, and memorized the history of the Great Trek. His comrades were often baffled. Why learn the tongue of the oppressor? Mandela's answer was cold and brilliant. To defeat your enemy, you must understand him, he explained. You must know his history, his fears, the songs he sings to his children. You must be able to speak to his heart if you ever hope to disarm his hand. Mandela was not learning Afrikaans to submit, he was searching for the cracks in the wall of white supremacy. He was learning how to negotiate before he had even been granted a seat at the table. By the mid-1970s, the quiet halls of the University of Stone were shaken by a new arrival. Following the 1976 Soweto uprising, hundreds of young activists were dumped onto the island. They were not like Mandela's generation. They were fiery, traumatized, and impatient. They had seen their friends shot in the streets, and they had no interest in long game, strategy or the polite debates of the elders. The tension was immediate. In the courtyards, a young prisoner stood before Mandela, his eyes blazing with a radical fury. "You talk of negotiation and law," the young man spat. "They murdered our children with our one rifles. Your old methods are dead, Madiba. The time for talking is over. We must burn the system to the ground." Mandela did not shout back. He did not pull rank. He did what he had learned in the Regent's Court decades before, he listened. He absorbed their anger, feeling the raw pulse of the new revolution. Then, slowly, he began to speak. He did not dismiss their passion, he channeled it. He taught them that anger without discipline is merely a fire that burns the house down from the inside. He tempered their radical energy with the hard-won wisdom of the elders. In this fusion of fire and stone, the movement was reborn. The prison was no longer a place of isolation. It was a central command post where the past and the future of the struggle were being forged into a single, unbreakable weapon. The year was 1985. Mandela had been moved from the island to the mainland, to Pollsmoor prison. The world was screaming for his release. Sanctions were biting, and the apartheid government was reeling. Desperate, President P.W. Botha went on national television. He made a public offer. Mandela would be released unconditionally if he simply signed a document renouncing violence as a political tool. It was a masterful trap. If Mandela accepted, he would be free, but the struggle would be decapitated, its moral authority surrendered. If he refused, the government could claim he was a man of blood who preferred prison to peace. Inside his cell, Mandela did not hesitate. He consulted with Sisulu and the others, then he took his pen and wrote his answer. On February 10, 1985, his daughter, Zinzi, stood before a packed, roaring stadium in Soweto. Tens of thousands of people held their breath as she opened a piece of paper. Her father's words, written in the silence of a cell, boomed across the nation. "I am surprised at the conditions that the government wants to impose on me," she read, her voice steady and proud. "I am not a violent man. But I cannot and will not give any undertaking at a time when I and you, the people, are not free. Your freedom and mine cannot be separated." The stadium erupted. The roar was so loud it seemed to shake the foundations of the government buildings in Pretoria. Zinzi reached the final line, the defiance of the University of Stone ringing clear. "I will return." P.W. Botha had the guns, the police, and the state. But he had just been taught a terrifying lesson: the most powerful man in South Africa was still the prisoner. Chapter 7, Tea with the Enemy. The summons came in the middle of the night, a time usually reserved for prison transfers or bad news. But as the guards entered Nelson Mandela's cell at Pollsmoor in the winter of 1988, there were no handcuffs. No rough commands. Instead, they told him to dress in his best suit. He was driven through the sleeping streets of Cape Town, past the jagged silhouette of Table Mountain, to a destination that was not a prison. He was ushered into a private residence, a world of deep velvet upholstery, polished mahogany, and the faint, expensive scent of floor wax. In a wood-paneled study, Kobe Coetzee, the Minister of Justice, the same man whose department had once demanded his hanging, sat waiting. He did not look at Mandela as a terrorist. He looked at him as a guest. "Would you like some tea, Nelson?" Coetzee asked. The offer was surreal. For 26 years, the state had spoken to him through iron bars, the sting of batons, and the ink-blotted lines of censored letters. Now, they were offering him a fragile china cup and a silver teaspoon. It was a calculated test of his temperament, a search for the man behind the myth. But Mandela understood the subtext immediately. The government was no longer trying to break him, they were trying to find a way to survive him. The game had changed. The prisoner was no longer just a captive, he was a partner in a high-stakes gamble for the soul of a nation. By December 1988, Mandela was moved again, this time to Victor Verster prison. But his cell was a warden's private cottage. He had a kitchen, a backyard, and a chef. To the world, it might have looked like comfort. To Mandela, it was a command post. He knew why the walls were thinning. Outside the prison gates, South Africa was screaming. The Vaal uprising had turned the townships into battlefields. International sanctions were strangling the economy, and the Free Mandela campaign had turned his face into a global icon. The apartheid state was a house on fire, and the men inside were finally realizing that the only person with the keys to the exit was the man they had locked away. Mandela did not wait for invitations. From his cottage, he seized the initiative. He drafted a secret memorandum to the government, laying out the terms for peace, the unbanning of the ANC, the release of all political prisoners, and the end of the state of emergency. He was a man in a gilded cage, yet he was the one setting the conditions. He was no longer reacting to the state, he was directing it. In December 1989, a new player entered the room, F.W. de Klerk, the pragmatist. Their first secret meeting was a clash of two worlds. De Klerk was a son of the Afrikaner establishment, hoping to reform the system just enough to save it. Mandela was the elder statesman of the revolution, demanding nothing less than its total dismantlement. They sat across from each other, the president and the prisoner, measuring the weight of each other's resolve. "I want to see a new South Africa," de Klerk said, searching for common ground. "Then you must recognize that your people cannot be free until mine are," Mandela replied. The breakthrough came on February 2, 1990. Mandela sat in his cottage, eyes fixed on a small television screen as de Klerk addressed Parliament. The words fell like hammer blows: the African National Congress was unbanned. The restrictions were lifted. The world he had fought for was being legalized in a single hour. Mandela watched in silence. He did not cheer. He knew that compromise was a weapon, and he had just moved the immovable. The end came with a sudden, chaotic rush. On the evening of February 10, 1990, de Klerk informed Mandela, "You will leave tomorrow." Mandela's reaction was stunning. He looked at the president and requested a week's delay. He wanted time to prepare his family, to coordinate with his comrades, to ensure the release was orderly. He was a man of discipline, and he refused to be hurried. But de Klerk refused. The momentum of history was now a runaway train. That night in the cottage was a whirlwind. Mandela sat with his advisors, drafting the speech he would give to a world he hadn't seen in nearly 3 decades. He felt the weight of 27 years of silence pressing against his chest. What do you say to a nation that has made you a god while you were a ghost? February 11, 1990. The gate of Victor Verster prison. The sun was blindingly bright. Mandela stood at the threshold, his hand tightly clutching his wife Winnie's. Beyond the gate, a sea of people stretched to the horizon. The roar of thousands of voices, a wall of sound fueled by decades of suppressed hope, crashed over him. He looked at the road ahead. He was 71 years old. He had spent 10,000 days in the dark. He squeezed Winnie's hand. Then, with the same measured pace he had used to walk into the quarry every morning, Nelson Mandela stepped forward, through the gate, and into the roaring light of a waiting world. Chapter 8, The Long Walk to Freedom. The world remembered the cheering. They remembered the sun-drenched afternoon of February 11, 1990, the sea of black, green, and gold flags, and the sight of Nelson Mandela walking through the gates of Victor Verster prison with his fist raised high. It felt like an ending, the final victory of a long struggle. But for Mandela, sitting in a quiet safe house just days later, the cheers had already been swallowed by the smell of smoke. The reports on the television screen were not of celebrations. They were of the matchbox houses of the townships engulfed in orange flames. They were of the frantic, high-pitched wails of mothers and the rhythmic thud of police Caspers. The conflict was no longer a simple line between black and white. A shadowy, brutal war had erupted between the ANC and the Inkatha Freedom Party. Behind the scenes, the Third Force, clandestine operatives within the state's own security apparatus, fed the fire with weapons and whispered lies. He had walked out of prison expecting to lead a march to freedom. Instead, he had walked into a war zone. The long walk had not ended, it had simply entered its most treacherous leg, a landscape of jagged glass and shifting shadows where the enemy was everywhere and nowhere. From 1990 to 1993, Mandela lived a schizophrenic reality. By day, he sat in the on-again, off-again negotiations. First at the Codesa talks, then in desperate bilateral meetings, trying to draft a constitution for a country tearing itself apart. He sat across from F.W. de Klerk, the man who had released him. Publicly, they were fierce adversaries. They traded accusations in the press like blows. Privately, the air between them was thick with a mistrust so heavy it was hard to breathe. "You are the head of state, F.W., Mandela said during one particularly bitter session, his voice low and vibrating with suppressed rage. "You have the police. You have the army. Yet my people are being slaughtered in the streets by men with state-issued rifles. Either you cannot control your forces, or you are choosing not to." De Klerk's face reddened, his fingers drumming a sharp, nervous rhythm on the table. "And your comrades, Nelson? They speak of peace here and armed struggle in the townships. You cannot control your own movement, yet you ask for the keys to the kingdom." It was a stalemate of blood. Mandela was forced to learn his hardest lesson, patience in the face of chaos. He had to keep the fragile peace process alive, negotiating with the very man he believed was arming his assassins. To walk away from the table was to invite the abyss. By early 1993, South Africa was a tinderbox. The conflict was no longer just political, it was communal and visceral. White families in the suburbs were stockpiling canned food and ammunition, terrified of a night of the long knives. In the townships, the youth, the lost generation, who had known only fire and stone, were losing faith. To them, negotiations looked like surrender. Mandela felt his authority slipping. The militant youth needed a hero who spoke their language. They found him in Chris Hani. Hani was a legend. The charismatic General Secretary of the South African Communist Party and a former commander of the ANC's armed wing, MK, he was the only man who could command the absolute loyalty of the angry streets. He was the firebrand to Mandela's diplomat. Mandela knew that without Hani, the movement would shatter into 1,000 radical shards. April 10, 1993. Easter Saturday. A quiet morning in the suburb of Dawn Park was shattered by lead. Chris Hani was assassinated in his own driveway, shot down by a white supremacist, a Polish immigrant named Janusz Walus. The news hit the nation like a tectonic shift. Within hours, the tinderbox exploded. An earthquake of rage swept from Soweto to Khayelitsha. The match had been thrown into the powder keg, and the roar of the fire was deafening. The streets filled with hundreds of thousands of people, their grief curdling into a demand for blood. The ANC's militant wing prepared for all-out retaliation. The racial civil war everyone had feared was no longer a possibility, it was an inevitability. In Pretoria, President de Klerk sat paralyzed. His state authority was shattered. He could command the police, but he could not command the heart of the people. The government was a hollow shell, silent and useless in the face of the coming storm. The phone rang in Mandela's office with the grim news. He looked out the window at a nation trembling on the edge of an abyss. The long walk had led here, to the precipice of hell. And he was the only one left who could speak. Chapter 9, The Speech That Saved a Nation. The evening of April 13, 1993, carried the weight of a century. Nelson Mandela sat in the sterile, brightly lit studio of the SABC, the very broadcast center that had spent decades portraying him as a monster. He was not yet the president. He held no official government office. But as the red, on-air, light flickered to life, everyone from the Cape to the Limpopo knew, he was about to govern. Mandela took a slow, deep breath and adjusted his glasses. The script in his hand wasn't just words, it was a damn wall. Outside the studio, South Africa was a landscape of raw, jagged fury. In the 3 tense days since the assassination of Chris Hani, the country had tilted toward the abyss. One wrong phrase, one slip of the tongue into bitterness, and the flood of vengeance would drown the nation forever. He began to speak. His voice was not the voice of a politician pleading for votes. It was a father's stern, grieving command. He validated the nation's agony, calling Hani's murder a watershed moment. But then, he performed a masterstroke of moral strategy. He told the story of Margaret Harms, the white Afrikaner woman who had risked her life to identify the assassin's car. A white man, full of prejudice and hate, came to our country and committed a deed so foul that our whole nation now teeters on the brink of disaster, he said, his eyes fixed on the lens. A white woman of Afrikaner origin risked her life so that we could know, and bring to justice, this assassin. With those words, he skillfully snatched the narrative away from race and placed it on the ground of justice. He turned black versus white into South Africa versus evil. As his voice echoed in shebeens and suburban living rooms, the distant sirens began to fade. The crowds paused. The nation exhaled. Leadership, he proved that night, is the act of stepping up when every other pillar has fallen apart. The miracle arrived a year later. April 27, 1994. The sun rose over a country that looked different. It was the silence that was most profound. Across the land, from the rolling hills of the Transkei to the dusty streets of Soweto, millions of people were standing in line. The queues snaked for miles over hills and around city blocks, a human rainbow of patience. An elderly black woman, who had lived her entire life as a non-citizen in her own land, leaned on a cane, her eyes fixed on the ballot box. A few feet away, a white former soldier stood nervously, checking his watch. There was no shouting, no violence, only a quiet, sacred resolve. After centuries of division, South Africa was speaking with a single voice. It was saying yes to a future it had never seen. When that elderly woman pressed her inked thumb to the paper, the chains of 300 years finally snapped. 2 weeks later, on May 10, the Union buildings in Pretoria, once the inner sanctum of apartheid, were transformed. As the jet fighters of the South African Air Force roared overhead, trailing smoke in the 6 colors of the new flag, Nelson Mandela stood before a world that had come to witness the impossible. His voice rang out over the cheering thousands, carrying the solemn, historic weight of an oath: never, never, and never again shall it be that this beautiful land will again experience the oppression of one by another and suffer the indignity of being the skunk of the world. Let freedom reign. The celebration ended as all celebrations must. Mandela walked into the president's office for the first time. He sat at the heavy oak desk and looked at the stacks of folders awaiting him. The silence here was different than the silence of the prison cell or the voting line. This was the silence of responsibility. The problems on his desk were monstrous. He looked at reports of 5 million unemployed and an economy in recession, a terrified white population fearing the revenge of the majority, a black population demanding houses, clean water, and dignity now, and an economy crippled by decades of sanctions and waste. Beneath the numbers lay the deepest wound of all. The generational, bone-deep hatred that still flickered in the hearts of his people. He walked to the window and looked out over the city of Pretoria. The statues of the men who had imprisoned him still stood in the squares below. He had won the right to lead. But as he stared at the divided city, the question hung in the air, unresolved and urgent. How do you unite a nation that has been taught, for generations, to hate itself? Chapter 10, The Captain of the Team. In 1995, the most dangerous animal in South Africa wasn't a lion or a leopard. It was a springbok. To the white Afrikaner, the leaping antelope in green and gold was a quasi-religious emblem. It was on their police uniforms, their flags, and the jerseys of their beloved national rugby team. But for black South Africans, that same symbol was a brand of pain. It was the mark of the men who had swung the batons. It was the logo of a sport that had excluded them for a century. As South Africa prepared to host the Rugby World Cup, the ANC's internal offices were a battlefield of debate. Abolish it, many argued. Scrap the springbok. Replace it with the protea. Why should we honor the symbol of our own oppression? Mandela listened to the fury, but he saw something else. He saw a stage. South Africa was hosting the world, but its soul was split in two. The tournament was a ticking clock, and Mandela knew that if he didn't find a way to change the nation's heart, he would watch it break again in front of a global audience. Mandela's strategy began not in a stadium, but in a quiet room with a young man named Francois Pienaar, the Springbok captain. Pienaar was a giant of a man, a son of the Afrikaner heartland, and he sat before the president with a mixture of awe and uncertainty. Mandela didn't ask for a political favor. He leaned in, his eyes bright with a shared purpose. Francois, he said, you must win this cup for all of South Africa. Not for the government. Not for one group. For every person who calls themselves a South African. When Mandela returned to his anxious ANC colleagues, they were baffled, even angry. You are embracing the enemy's colors, Madiba, they whispered. Mandela stood his ground. To build a new nation, you must take the symbols of the old and pour new meaning into them, he told them. This jersey is not just cloth, it is an empty vessel. We will not destroy it. We will fill it with unity. June 24, 1995. Ellis Park Stadium, Johannesburg. The atmosphere was a powder keg of old South African pride. The stands were a sea of over 60,000 faces, many still waving the old blue, white, and orange apartheid flags. They had come to watch their team play New Zealand's legendary All Blacks. They expected a sporting match, they didn't expect a revolution. As the teams prepared to walk out, a figure emerged from the tunnel. The stadium fell into a stunned, vacuum-like silence. The roar died in 60,000 throats. There, walking onto the pitch, was Nelson Mandela. But he wasn't in a suit. He was wearing the green and gold Springbok jersey, and on his back was Pienaar's number 6. The recognition hit the crowd like a physical wave. For a heartbeat, then two, the air stayed still. Then, a single voice in the stands began a chant. Tentative at first, Nelson. Another voice joined. Then 100. Then 1,000. Within seconds, it became a thunderous, rolling, emotional earthquake that shook the very foundations of the stadium. Nelson. 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 In that moment, the symbol of division was shattered and remade. The white fans weren't cheering for a politician, they were cheering for their president. The power wasn't in the jersey, it was in the breathtaking forgiveness of the man wearing it. This was reconciliation in action, a masterclass in the theater of the soul. The Springboks won in the final minutes. As Mandela handed the Webb Ellis Cup to a tearful Francois Pienaar, he leaned in. Francois, thank you for what you have done for our country. Pienaar looked his president in the eye and replied, No, Mr. President. Thank you for what you have done for our country. For one golden afternoon, South Africa was genuinely one nation. The psychological barrier had been breached. The transcendent unity of the cup had shown what was possible. As his term progressed, with the memory of the stadium's unity still vivid, Mandela made a decision. In a world where power was a drug, and on a continent where leaders often held onto it for life, the expectation was clear: he would lead for as long as he lived. Mandela looked around at his expectant colleagues. He thought of the long walk, the stone quarry, and the stadium roar. I will serve one term, he said, his voice calm, quiet, and final. When the time comes, I will step down. The room went silent. Nelson Mandela, the ultimate captain, was planning his voluntary exit from the field. He had taught his people how to fight, how to forgive, and now, with this final, graceful play, he would teach them, and the world, the most profound lesson of all, how to let go. Chapter 11, The Smile of the Ancestors. In the early 2000s, if you had walked into the living room of a quiet home in Houghton, you wouldn't have seen the prisoner of the century or the president of the Rainbow Nation. You would have seen an old man on the carpet, his knees stiff and his back curved by time, playing a game of tag with his grandchildren. To them, he wasn't a myth carved from marble. He was Tat-U Mandela, the grandfather who told long stories and gave the best hugs. But the peace of retirement was an illusion. Nearby, on a low mahogany table, sat a briefcase bursting with medical reports, infection statistics, and letters from desperate doctors. The phone would ring, and the grandfather would vanish. In his place stood the fighter. Even as his body began to slow, Nelson Mandela had taken up one final, desperate struggle, to break the silence of a pandemic that was devastating his nation. This is the story of the man after the myth, a man grappling with the limits of time and the heavy shadows of his own legacy. The crusade against HIV/AIDS wasn't just political, it was a wound in his own home. In 2005, Mandela faced a microphone with a grief that no amount of political training could mask. His son, Makatho, had died of the disease. In a country where the virus was shrouded in shame and whispered secrets, Mandela chose the light. Let us give publicity to HIV/AIDS and not hide it, he told the nation, transforming his personal tragedy into a fierce, national mission to shatter the stigma. He stepped onto the world stage one last time, not for politics, but for life, headlining the 46,664 benefit concerts and championing treatment access. His voice was thinner, a rasping reed in the wind, but its moral authority was undimmed. Yet, in the quiet of his library, looking at faded family photos, Mandela confronted a different kind of pain. He thought of the children who had grown up while he was in a cell, the letters he couldn't send, the marriages that had cracked and splintered under the impossible weight of the struggle. He was honest enough to admit his own failings. He had helped birth a nation, but he knew he had sometimes failed those closest to him. He was no saint. He was a man who had made a profound sacrifice, and in the twilight of his life, the bill had finally come due in the silence of his heart. The end was a long, slow sunset. From 2011 to 2013, the world lived in a state of constant vigil. Every hospital stay was a headline, every breath was a global prayer. We were practicing how to mourn him while he was still with us. On December 5, 2013, the long goodbye ended. The announcement of his passing didn't bring screams or chaos, but a profound, global silence, the kind of silence that follows the falling of a great oak. Then, the world began to sing. Flowers piled up in London, candles flickered in Harlem, and in Soweto, the people danced in the streets to celebrate a life that had defined an era. 10 days later, they took him home to the rolling green hills of Kunu. Surrounded by tribal elders, military honors, and the world's leaders, the circle finally closed. The prisoner, the president, and the legend was once again a son of the soil, laid to rest among his ancestors. The long walk had reached its end. We often think of Nelson Mandela as a figure of destiny, a man of iron and grace. But the secret of Mandela is that he was human. He was a man who could be stubborn and short-tempered. A man who loved cricket, fancy shirts, and terrible TV soap operas. His power didn't come from being perfect. It came from his relentless, human try. He kept trying, to learn the language of his enemy, to forgive the men who stole his youth, to build a house for people who had only ever known fire. Mandela's work is not a closed book, it is an open invitation. He walked the long walk so that we could run. He was the prisoner so that we could know freedom. Now, the question he leaves with us is not about the past, but about today. What will you do with your freedom? The country of your own life, your community, your world, it is waiting to be freed. The spear of the nation has been set down. It is in your hands now.
Thank you so much for listening to Nelson Mandela, the prisoner who freed a country. It has been an incredible privilege to walk this journey through history with you. We would love to hear what you felt was most powerful about his story. Please comment down below, what moved or surprised you the most? What kind of biography would you like to hear next? If you'd like to continue this journey through history, click the video on your screen now to listen to our biography of another legendary leader who fought for unity, Abraham Lincoln. Thank you for watching, and remember, the story of courage is never finished.